Tom Harris is joining us right now to talk about the French Climate Accord. Good afternoon, sir. How are you? Welcome to the program.
Yeah, it's good to talk to you, Charlie.
So we're getting back in the French Climate Accord, but what good is that going to do us? I mean, we've already made great strides in doing away with our carbon emissions. Is it just going to be we're going to be there to write a check?
Practically, yeah. And I get the impression that President Biden may not have read the Paris Agreement, because on page 1, it states very clearly that the Paris Agreement, it says, is based on the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is this UNFCCC treaty, in which they basically say that developing countries don't have to ever reduce their emissions because their first and overriding priorities are not emissions reduction, it's poverty alleviation and development.
So that's got nothing to do with climate.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because during the election campaign, President Biden promised that he wouldn't let China and other nations game the system with respect to emissions reduction. And yet the Paris Agreement is exactly how Beijing is gaming the system.
Right.
So it's a bit ridiculous because, everybody can see that, China can increase until 2030. United States is supposed to cut right away, and that doesn't make any sense because China puts out twice as much emissions as the U.S. But it's even deeper than that. The fact is, China and these other countries will not have to ever reduce emissions because of the underlying treaty that Paris is based on that says they don't have to, essentially.
Right. And how are they granted developing nation status?
Well, it's a good question. That occurred in 1992 when the Framework Convention was first ratified. And at that time, they were classified as developing nations. I mean, they didn't have any billionaires, for example, whereas now they got many of them. So, yeah, they just haven't changed the designation. And, it's interesting, in the Peru UN Climate Conference, they asked the Chinese delegate if, in fact, they would consider changing the Framework Convention. And he said very clearly that the purpose of Paris was to enforce the Framework Convention, not to change it.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So let me ask you this. I mean, even if if everybody in the Paris Climate Accord follows it to the letter, how much does it change the environment?
Well, essentially nothing, because, they give numbers like fractions of a degree or whatever, but you have to realize that they can't even measure the global temperature, which doesn't really exist. It's just a statistical average. They can't really even measure these to that kind of accuracy. So the Paris Agreement would have no impact. In fact, many of the leading climate alarmists, they say very clearly, Paris is just a first step on a very long journey if we're going to save the climate. But no, Paris wouldn't do really anything.
No, it would not do nothing. And another question, how does it help the United States?
Well, it certainly doesn't. And in fact, it's interesting, back in 2017, the previous head of the Environmental Protection Agency, Scott Pruitt, he indicated what, in fact, was another side to this. You see, the developing countries only have to actually follow their emission commitments if they're given enough money and technology aid from the West. And here's his quote. India, for example, conditioned all their responsibilities on receiving $2.5 trillion of aid. So, indeed, it's going to be extremely expensive. It will have no impact. And the developing countries will increase their emissions as much as they want.
This is like my last gym membership. I am paying a lot of money for something I'm never going to use, and it's not going to do any good.
Yeah, exactly. And, I think President Biden, he's got to look back to when he was senator, because he was on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee who issued a report concerning climate agreements like this. And he said that if those agreements actually involved adopting targets and timetables for emissions reduction, then it should be submitted to the Senate for its advice and consent. And in fact, that report from Biden, it actually went to the Senate floor along with the Framework Convention, and the Framework Convention was ratified under that condition, that future agreements had to go to the Senate for actual advice and consent. So he's violating his own Senate Foreign Relations Committee report that he was on.
Well, hey, if they didn't have double standards, they would have no standards at all. Tom Harris, Executive Director of the Ottawa, Canada-based International Climate Science Coalition, thank you so much for being on the program, sir. We hope to talk to you soon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Charlie.
106.3 WORD, this is The Charlie James Show.